"What's next?" he asked me. "Excuse me?" I said. "What's next?" he asked again. And being a recent seminary graduate and a recently enrolled hospital chaplain in training, I responded confidently to the man's question about what would be coming next. I was, after all, the expert, and so I told him everything I knew. I offered one of my first hospital patients a lengthy dialogue on the various theologies and theories of heaven and hell and life after death. "Well, people have different opinions about what's next," I began. And 10, 20 minutes later, after my erudite discussion, he looked at me blankly from his hospital bed. "That's nice," he said. "So what happens next? Is the doctor coming to see me? Are there more scans? What's the plan for today?" Sometimes listening is more important than we might think. I think Christians in general could learn a few things from the rabbit in our story this morning, especially about listening. We're not so great at it sometimes, maybe even often. We're much better at telling people all sorts of things, especially what to think and why. I think part of that bad habit of focusing solely on the telling is about orthodoxy, our focus on correct beliefs. What someone says they believe about God, about Jesus, about the Christian life. And often we frame the Christian way of living itself as primarily about believing the right things, reciting the correct doctrinal statements, and of course denouncing those who don't, because what fun is it to be right if you don't get to tell others that they're wrong? Which is why so often the book of James that we heard read this morning is lifted up by proponents of orthopraxy, that is, right practice or correct practice, the equally important focus on righteous living rather than righteous thought alone. Often, James is held as the chief proponent of our faith's insistence on living holy lives devoted to others, because faith and works are always connected. What you believe will transform what you do, and what you do will transform the way you think and the way you believe. James tells us that the Christian faith without works is dead, that we must be doers of the word and not just hearers. And to that aim, James is chiefly concerned with justice, with the poor, with the rich. And because of that, James has brutal things to say about the wealthy who cause the suffering of the impoverished. And so it's surprising to remember that even for James, whose focus is faith put into action, even with a book like that, there are passages like the one we read this morning that begin with what many of us would consider inaction, that start with listening instead. We just heard it read. "You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to act, quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger." If I'm honest, these are not my favorite portions of James. In reading our children's book today, I find myself more relating to the bear. I don't know about you. I love to come in screaming. Or I love to play the part of the chicken. Surely we can solve every problem if we just talk about it with enough detail and for long enough. And sometimes I have to see myself in the snake too. I love to ruin someone else's castle, even if it doesn't help me. At least it feels good, right? And so how do we square James's encouragement towards slow, careful thoughtfulness with his larger dynamic call to action, with even the outright rage that James himself shares toward the rich just a few pages later? In chapter 5, James does not seem so worried about anger when he writes, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you." How do we hold these two things together? Well, firstly, I think we read this passage in the wrong way. James doesn't say that speaking and anger aren't options. James says that they're not our first options. For the Christian, he asserts the default response is always listening first. And then you can tell the wealthy oppressors just how evil they are, like James does. Which kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to challenge empires like Jesus did, if you're going to call out the wealthy in your community like James did, you better have the facts right. Listening might just be the most practical first step. Gather the data, figure out who your enemies really are, know their weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and then you can attack. But I think there's a deeper spiritual truth as well behind James' insistence on listening, on silence as the first step toward radical Christian justice work. Bible scholar Elsa Temez points out the centrality of patience in James's letter. But she wants her readers to know that this isn't the sit still and be quiet kind of patience. She points out that the word for patience that James uses in the Greek is actually a word for military action, for battle strategy. It's hypomone. And she points out that this military word needs to be translated differently. And so instead, she argues that we have to translate James' first chapter not as advocating passivity, but as militant patience, or even nonviolent resistance, she might say. Scholar Gay Byron goes a step further translating this word hypomone for us, writing that James is seeking something more foundational than patience or even nonviolence, even if it's militant or resistant. James is calling for a spiritual discipline that will provide strength, support, and connection to God even when we face hardships. I think that so much of the spiritual work that James is commending is a cultivation of silence, of meditation before acting, while acting, before the next action, of constantly listening for God's word in ourselves, from our neighbors, from the Christian community, to inform our acting and give us strength to persevere. And so maybe it's not surprising that James' manifesto on Christian action and Christian patience while acting begins with the insistence, the encouragement to first be quiet, to listen, don't speak just yet. The rabbit in our story this morning knew how powerful silence could be in helping a friend rebuild their life. And sometimes listening is the only action needed. And James knows that the initial silence leads us toward truly being doers of God's word and seekers of God's justice. And I think that James Weldon Johnson, several centuries later, knew a few things about the power of silence as well. Just like our biblical author, it's strange to think of James Weldon Johnson connected with silence, because in addition to being an activist in the civil rights movement, he was also a gifted writer and lyricist. He wrote the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and Sing that we sang last Sunday here at Govans. But in 1917, in response to anti-black lynchings and racist violence across the United States, Johnson, as field secretary for the NAACP, led a group of community leaders who decided that a silent protest with only the sound of muffled drums would be the most powerful response. It wasn't that they weren't going to speak. It wasn't that they weren't going to show the righteous anger that those crimes deserved in response. But they decided to start with silence. Let's see a little more about what that looked like.
Hi, I'm Alicia Perez, and I did my project on the Negro Silent Protest Parade that happened in July of 1917 during the Harlem Renaissance. It started when raiders were attacking black homes, which ended up causing a riot that left 48 dead, hundreds injured, and thousands of blacks fleeing their homes as they were being burned to the ground. Meanwhile, police and state militia did little to prevent these attacks. So on July 28, 1917, the NAACP organized a protest with a silent march down Fifth Avenue, New York, that included 8,000 black men, women, and children. The protesters marched behind a row of drummers and carried banners calling for justice and equal rights. The only sound heard was the sound of muffled drums. The men, women, and children participating carried signs that read, "Mother, do lynchers go to heaven? Give me a chance to live, and your hands are full of blood." James Weldon Johnson was a key organizer of the protest. During the parade, Boy Scouts passed out flyers describing the NAACP's struggle against the segregation, lynching, discrimination, and other forms of racial oppression. These flyers also outlined the objectives and goals of the march. It read, "We march because, by the grace of God and the force of truth, the dangerous hampering walls of prejudice and inhumane injustices must fall. We march because we want to make impossible a repetition of Waco, Memphis, and East St. Louis by arousing the conscience of the country and bringing the murderers of our brothers, sisters, and innocent children to justice. We march because we deem it a crime to be silent in the face of such barbaric acts. We march because we are thoroughly opposed to Jim Crow cars, segregation, discrimination, disenfranchisement, lynching, and the host of evils that are forced on us. It is time that the Spirit of Christ should be manifested in the making and execution of laws. We march because we want our children to live a better life and enjoy fairer conditions than we have."
Faith and works, silence and action, listening and speaking, they're all connected. But I think James, our biblical author, knows that it's going to take a while. And Christians will need that militant patience, that hypomone, if we're going to keep the work of Jesus going. We'll need that spiritual discipline of listening to each other, of listening to our own selves as we act and reflect and act again. We need that militant action as we continue the work that James Weldon Johnson and Ida B. Wells and so many others started as we push today for the passage of the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. We need that militant patience as we care for one another, as we rebuild our lives, as we work so that fewer lives are broken in the first place. And so speak, act, be doers of God's word, otherwise our faith is dead. But listen too, for the God who works alongside you, for the God who keeps working when all hope seems lost, for the God who shows up with the patience of a rabbit to listen and to wait and to dare you to dream again. Please pray with me. Holy One, for all that waiting, for all that watching, for all that working, we give thanks that we don't do it alone. Rededicate our lives to that work, to the rebuilding, to the watching, to the being surprised. For that we give thanks together. Amen.